So why do I personally think that Tom King is engaging in and using so many elements of Silver Age Wonder Woman, and why do I feel he is failing at his attempt? Now, this is probably going to be a several-parter because I'm never quite certain how much people do and don't know. I also don't know what part of the world people are from and how much history they know. So let's start with the Second Red Scare and McCarthyism. So for those of you who are either not American or not aware of the history at the time, the Second Red Scare was what we call a moral panic. On the off chance you're unaware of what a moral panic is, it's when a condition, an idea, a person, or a group of persons emerges to be identified as a threat to society and societal values. In the case of McCarthyism and the Second Red Scare, this ultimately culminated in blacklisting of anybody who was viewed as having communist or communist sympathising views, a swing back to conservatism in the US, and a whole bunch of congressional and Senate hearings on what was considered morally acceptable for the American public. Specifically in the US, this resulted in 1953 the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency. This subcommittee was set up on the basis of the public's reaction to the book by Frederick Wertham, The Seduction of the Innocent. Now, if you're a DC fan, I'm certain you've heard that name mentioned before. It's most commonly mentioned in relation to Batman and Robin, even though ultimately it had a lot smaller of an impact on them in comparison to Wonder Woman, in part because some of the critiques he had were valid, and by that I don't mean that I think they were critiques which should result in the reduction of Wonder Woman. I'm meaning that the things he saw as bad were actually things included. Them had actually been campaigning since 1948 to have the age of purchase for comic books be increased to the age of 16, as he thought comic books contributed to juvenile delinquency and the moral erosion of America. It is also worth noting that Wertham only managed to avoid the Red Scare as somewhat of a communist himself by pointing the finger in another direction. I do think the views he held were genuine views, if misguided, but it also ensured that he was able to weather the storm and continue to provide support to the children in Harlem he was providing with psychotherapy. So in 1954, when Wertham's Seduction of the Innocent was published, there were also Senate hearings specifically to do with comic books. And this is how we get to the Comic Code Authority. Now, once again, if you're a comic book fan or if you've read any older comics, you've definitely seen the Comic Code Authority's logo about at some point. It's that little stamp-looking thing which says CCA in it. Now, after these hearings, it was essentially decided that the comic book industry, rather than receiving direct government oversight, would set up their own organisation and their own code to help dictate what comics could and couldn't do. It's also worth noting that certain comic book companies chose to not publish under the Comic Code Authority label and did face some legal repercussions and some blowback and reduction of accessibility of publishing and where they could and couldn't sell said comics. Now, if you want to, you can search Comic Code Authority and read the full original list of the rules which were published in 1945, but some of them directly and specifically undercut Wonder Woman and her content. You weren't allowed to present female bodies in certain ways, you weren't allowed to show anything which might hint at perversion or moral decay, which meant some of the borderline kink content or anything which was inspired by kink had to go. Anything which was considered profane, obscene, vulgar, or perverse was fully not allowed, and you were no longer allowed to present the criminals in any sort of manner which made them perceived to be sympathetic. You could also not present law enforcement or the government in a way which would lead to them being questioned in real life. Comic Code Authority would continue to be in place and enforced to some degree right up until the 21st century, but DC first pushed back in 1971. Specifically, there were certain things with Marv Wolfman where DC went to bat for him, and the Comic Code Authority and the codified rules were actually changed in 1971. In 1984, Swamp Thing issue 29 resulted in the CCA not giving DC approval and DC going, okay, whatever, we're publishing it anyway. By the time that Vertigo showed up in 1993, DC had essentially given up on getting consistent approval from Comic Code Authority, although you would still see their seal and approval right up through the 2000s. Whilst for some pretty obvious reasons I'm not particularly a fan of the Comic Code Authority, and I'm deeply annoyed at the way that they took what was a pretty political and fascinating medium and turned it into some pretty generic, whilst quite fun, Monster of the Week content for quite a bit. It's worth noting that in the case of Wonder Woman, Comic Code Authority just gave the individual who was already in power freedom to do the full rehaul that he wanted to. Now, William Moulton Marston, also known as Charles Moulton, that was his pen name and also Joy Hummel's pen name when they were writing together and when she was ghostwriting for him. He had passed of cancer and polio in 1947, and when he passed, Bob Kanigher, who's known for a whole range of things at DC, took over with writing Wonder Woman. Now, when Marston passed, it wasn't just him we lost, it was the direct female element both within the writing room and surrounding Wonder Woman. Obviously, once Marston passed, there was no longer the impact that Olive and Elizabeth had, and Joy Hummels also stepped back from Wonder Woman. I've just recently made a video if you want to go and watch that. This was the first time in Diana's existence, despite her being largely written and created by a man, that women had had no direct impact on how her and her stories went. It is worth noting that H.G. Peter, who did directly work with Marston, he was the original artist, and he's who we know for doing that like Koopy style, World War II Diana. He did stick around until issue 98, but by the time the Comic Code Authority came into power, he was also forced off the title. So 1948, right at the beginning of the Red Scare, we have Bob Kanigher taking over with issue 30, and he had very, very different views to Marston as to what perfect femininity was and who women should be. Fast forward to 1958, Comic Code Authority is in full swing. Robert Kanigher is now no longer just the writer of Wonder Woman, but an editor at DC in general. He has been able to force H.G. Peters, the last holdover from the Marston era, off the Wonder Woman comic, and he is able to start implementing what he views as peak and ideal femininity into Wonder Woman. Gone are the little interludes, the little stories about the importance of strong, unique, hardworking women in the world, and they are replaced with pretty standard girls' comics for the time. Little stories about marriage around the world, about how to be feminine, how to be a good wife, how girls are, so focused on boys and just can't wait to get that next date, but in a socially acceptable and courtship manner, of course. He also, in issue 98, completely rehauls the Amazons. There is probably some deeper commentary about why all Fox presenters have the same bleach blonde hair and Republican makeup in the fact that he made a lot more of the Amazons blonde, and most notably, he made Hippolyta blonde and gave her a more sort of stereotypical mother attitude and mother role. He also changes the story with Hercules and Hippolyta to make it a lot more palatable. One of the things that the Comic Code Authority did specifically state is that rape wasn't allowed to be depicted, or specifically referenced. Also changes the dynamic between Steve and Diana, and changes the joke and the undertones between Steve asking Diana to marry him, whereas previously Steve asked knowing that Diana was going to say no and remained sort of committed to her. He now gets really creepy with it and tries to trick her into marriage. You've now got the backstory for Silver Age Wonder Woman, how it happened, why Robert Kanigher was in charge, and how it changed Diana, and also, in my opinion, why Silver Age Wonder Woman tends to be largely forgotten about. There is a reason when George Perez rebooted Wonder Woman, he chose to eschew a whole bunch of the stuff from Silver Age Wonder Woman and go back to the Marston original, or just simply create his own stuff. Whilst Kanigher's run was not one that Tom King specifically mentioned when he was talking about Wonder Woman originally, he has brought the name up repeatedly more recently, specifically in connection to his Black Canary mini. Now, as I mentioned, Kanigher was not just a writer at DC, he was also an editor, and he also was involved with a whole range of things, including Mother to the Black Canary we know now, who was also Black Canary, Dinah Drake. We also know he's familiar with Silver Age Wonder Woman in general because his Wonder Woman Black and Gold story played on the Denny O'Neil era of Silver Age Wonder Woman, which was also suboptimal. And before anybody twists it, I do have a world's worth of respect for Denny O'Neil for what he did with Batman later on, but Wonder Woman was one of his first works at DC. He himself admitted that it was quite bad and that he wasn't quite prepared to handle the character, and whilst his original run wasn't great, it's worth noting that short little story in Wonder Woman Black and Gold that Tom King wrote was actually not bad. It's a really sweet story about the friendship between Clark and Diana. But going back to his current run, there are a lot of, I'm not even going to call them clues because they are just straight up things which have been taken from Silver Age, which she is using. Obviously, Angleman was a villain who actually originally started out in Silver Age. He was the founder of the Academy of Arch-Villains, where the main villain for his next arc, that is Mouseman, originally showed up. We also have Wonder Woman Volume 1, Issue 124, where Wonder Tot, Wonder Girl, and Wonder Woman first worked together. They would then go on to have a couple of comics called Impossible Tales or Impossible Adventures. This is very plainly being riffed on for the Trinity World's Finest series that's coming out. The tone of the backup issues have very much been the flavour of the periodical, which was coming out quite frequently in Silver Age. Now, as to why Tom King is choosing to riff on this, we need to talk about an essay or a little story that he put in the back of the Animal Pound ash can. Now I know, but just stick with me for a second, okay? Now, Tom King is not a fan of the current administration. He is not a fan of the direction in which the Republican Party has gone, and for all intents and purposes, he does seem to be essentially a neolib. The reason I'm mentioning the little essay in the back of Animal Pound is excluding the part where he completely mangles and misinterprets what Animal Farm is about. It is not about the rise of the Communist Party in the UK. It really isn't. You can choose to interpret it that way, but that was not the intent, that was not the purpose. It also doesn't work particularly well for a whole range of reasons, which would be another video essay within itself as that concept. In his essay, he essentially states that whilst communism obviously bad by his worldview, that uncritical following and witch hunts are negative, and he parallels that with what is happening, even though he doesn't say it word for word, with trans individuals and with individuals today. Now, I obviously don't disagree with the summation that we should not be blindly following anything just simply because it's party lines, and that ideologies can be weaponized to be harmful. I disagree, however, with some of the conclusions he draws. And one of those big conclusions, and something which is missing from a lot of his writing, is the fact that the American dream, the American concept, does not inherently work, or rather, it is working as intended, and as it is intended is not actually for the good of everybody. Tom King wants to write a progressive tale and wants to combat certain things, but he is unwilling to truly analyse and break apart the inherent Americanness of certain negative things. Now, because of the accent, before I continue with this, it's worth noting that this call is coming from inside the house. I actually lived in these States for over 2 decades. I became a citizen in 2015. I was raised within that culture by parents who were not of that culture. And Tom King and the way he writes shows that he is unwilling to accept the parts that capitalism and the puritanical nature built into the bedrock of the US contributes to things such as moral panics. And the fact that he chose to make some form of fictional monarch in the background, twisting everything, making it bad and evil, shows that he's not yet willing to put in the work which is required to make this story truly work. Now, it's not just because I disagree with the summation of the issues, it's that there is not the strong enough argument made for the problems in real life for it to parallel successfully. It's also worth noting that I actually don't think we're at the end with the Sovereign yet. Whilst Trinity has confronted him, we do need to remember that everything he is saying is coming from the mouth of somebody who is classed as the Prince of Lies or the Lord of Lies. I also am still not fully convinced that Lizzie is in fact the child of Diana in the way she is presented to be. But the fact that there is the clinging to and the respect and the love, not for the American people, because there is absolutely nothing wrong with Diana being down hard for the American people, she would absolutely be, but it's the respect and connection to these symbols in a wholly American way that an Amazon would not necessarily have. There's also the fact that certain characters, to make this story work, have been reverted or rolled back without any explanation whatsoever. Like, for instance, Etta being included at the end as an afterthought, as some form of midwife or emotional support to a woman she does not know who has caused harm to those she loved, doesn't feel particularly like a comfortable or reasonable place to be putting that character. Steve, who was a member of Checkmate exactly because he realised that the system wasn't working and that being loyal to the American government was not allowing him to be loyal to the American people and his view of what America could be in all her glory. That being reverted and shoving him back into the military structure without any explanation as to why also doesn't make sense. The fact that there is an unwillingness, deliberate or not, to acknowledge the fact that America has the perfect pressure cooker to result in aggressive moral panics, in large part because of its nature as a largely evangelical country. I would argue that sidestepping religion in general to avoid discussing the ways in which the aspects of specifically American femininity work is attempting to deconstruct the Silver Age of Wonder Woman, whilst he's still, deliberately or not, still co-signing onto many of the aspects which led to Kanaya being in the place where he was able to then attempt to dictate what femininity was through the comic in a way that completely ignored the strength and beauty of who Diana originally was with the input of women. He has not done the work necessary in the comic for me to believe that when he centres, deliberately or not, Bruce and Clark and Damie and John, that he is doing so in a manner that he will later break down. It seems like he is genuinely including them and adding them as aspects of what makes Diana Diana. And don't get me wrong, her friendship, her connection to man's world is undoubtedly important, including through Steve, but he seems to miss the beauty of what makes their friendships really work. And he doesn't seem to view her as enough of an independent character to actually spend that time with her. And I understand that part of it is the narration from Sovereign, right? We are meant to be viewing her through the lens of this great invisible patriarch. But it doesn't work because he's not gained the trust of the reader by showing the explicit knowledge and understanding of who Diana is today, in large part from the Piers and Marston work, and what makes her so beautiful and wonderful and feminine. It just ultimately feels like he's more interested in the masculinity aspect.